Alrighty, sorry about the delay, but we should be up and running now. Welcome back to the apparently 97th installment, believe it or not, of Free Read Fridays in its myriad forms. It's now called Free Read Fridays. It was not always thus, but I rather, am making an executive decision and considering all these reading aloud things to be all part of one series, even if I've changed the name. Um, so because I don't have a real plan for how I'm going to proceed in the wake of reading Artemis. I am at this point going to probably do some short stories from Luminous by Greg Egan. It's a short story collection, collecting a bunch of stuff he's done. I've read his axiomatic short story collection as one of my earliest um, major reading projects. It did not start off as major and then kind of turned into one because I was like, oh, geez, I'm going to read all of these again because they were cool. I liked them. Um, I had already read Axiomatic at least twice, the entire short story collection by that point in time, even though I hadn't had it all that long. So I knew I wanted to do that. I have only read through Luminous once, so this is going to be kind of a bit of rediscovery, but I do remember basically liking it. Um, Although the short story Luminous itself like a lot of the short stories here are a little harder to nail down, I guess. Um, and then he's got another short story collection, uh, Oceanic, and yet another after that, Instantiation. I'm trying to remember if I've actually read Instantiation. I might not have. I know I read Oceanic though. He's got plenty of other books though, and I can gush about him. He he is a unique character, Greg Egan. Um, he one of his claims to fame is he does not have a picture of him on the internet. Um, so nobody, except for him and people who actually know him, nobody knows what he looks like. He doesn't make a habit of going to many conventions. Um, he's also like I think a former physicist or mathematician who has a sideline in writing pretty entertaining, for the most part, some exceptions, pretty entertaining science fiction novels and short stories. I am especially fond of his short story collections. I don't think there's been a complete dud of his that I've read in terms of short story collections yet. Even if there's like some short stories within them that are kind of like, okay. Even even if there were any of those, on balance, they're all good. His novels, his more recent novels have kind of lost me because I think they're finally at a point where they're a little beyond my comprehension. Or at least they're hard enough for me to keep track of. And I know I've harped about his method of world building, particularly for the Arrow of Time trilogy. Uh, so, world building. Most people think, oh, go with what you know, world build. Build a world that's believable, make it internally consistent. Greg Egan says, yes, make it internally consistent. Give it its own laws of physics and chemistry, and then basically just set the book be about like average Joes and Schmoes living in said world, or not so average Joes and Schmoes living in said world, which is running on completely different physics than our own, and just like taking it all to the logical extreme, um, which I think is brilliant. But whoo, at least in the Arrow of Time trilogy, uh, there were some charts. There were charts and graphs and explanations for a lot of things. And because he's having to explain, no, you can't actually do this in our reality, but you can here because the laws of physics allow it. In this case, sort of time travel. And by sort of, I mean absolutely time travel, but like time travel the long way, and by long way, I mean like, oh, you want to travel into the future? Easy, just stick yourself in stasis or whatever. Just keep living your life. You'll get to the future eventually. In this case, it's more like traveling back through time the long way. So it's a whole thing. We're not reading any of that today though, and probably not ever. I don't even know how I would begin to read those aloud. Uh, because I I'd have to get a lot of the charts out and have them as static images on the screen, and I would have to find a way of doing that was artful, and I'm not doing that right now. In other news, where I am finally opened up slightly the age brackets in which you can get COVID shots. So I have done that. So if for some reason I start frothing at the mouth, or whatever, you know why. So what I'm looking at doing for today is, at the very least, this first short story, Chaff, because it's interesting. Um, and then probably, possibly, maybe, Mitochondrial Eve, the second story after it. I will probably not do Luminous um, today, anyway. And after that, I will have to decide, mostly because Luminous is long. That's like, I don't know, 60 pages, I think. How many is that? That's 50 pages, give or take. A little under 50. There's some really good short stories in here that I do want to do. Um, one of which is about a guy who has some kind of brain disease. I forget why. Uh, it's not a tumor. It's not a tumor, but it's kind of like that. That is basically setting off certain parts of his brain. Um, so as a young child, he's got it, and it's basically setting off like the pleasure centers of his brain in such a way that everything he does, he's just happy about. Unfortunately, this condition is killing him, and so his parents set forth to cure it by getting rid of the brain damage via surgery or something. I'm not remembering it totally right now. And then nothing, nothing. He can be happy about nothing. So his life goes down the shitter. And it's a story about kind of like accepting that, the come down of that. And then he's offered sort of a bargain, a almost a Faustian bargain. Um, After he's lived years of his life that way. I hope we get to that. It won't be today, but eventually. So what I was planning on doing after I interrupted myself, what I was planning on doing is for after today's stream, but for subsequent, I was going to do Heavy Time by C.J. Sherry, but I may just wind up doing all of Luminous, and then the C.J. Sherry that I was going to do. I haven't decided yet. You'll find out next week. Okay. So, without further ado, let's get this puppy rolling. I have yammered on for 10 whole minutes, so let's yammer with a bit more direction, shall we? Chaff by Greg Egan. El Nido de Ladrones, the nest of thieves, occupies a roughly elliptical region, 50,000 square kilometers in the western Amazon lowlands, straddling the border between Colombia and Peru. It's difficult to say exactly where the natural rainforest ends and the engineered species of El Nido take over, but the total biomass of the system must be close to 1 trillion tons. 1 trillion tons of structural material, osmotic pumps, solar energy collectors, cellular chemical factories, and biological computing and communications resources, all under the control of its designers. The old maps and databases are obsolete. By manipulating the hydrology and soil chemistry and influencing patterns of rainfall and erosion, the vegetation has reshaped the terrain completely, shifting the course of the Putumayo River, drowning old roads in swampland, raising secret causeways through the jungle. This biogenic geography remains in a state of flux, so that even the eyewitness accounts of the rare defectors from El Nido soon lose their currency. Satellite images are meaningless. At every frequency, the forest canopy conceals or deliberately falsifies the spectral signature of whatever lies beneath. Chemical toxins and defoliants are useless. The plants and their symbiotic bacteria can analyze most poisons and reprogram their metabolisms to render them harmless, or transform them into food, faster than our agricultural warfare experts can invent new molecules. Biological weapons are seduced, subverted, domesticated. Most of the genes from the last lethal plant virus we introduced were found 3 months later, incorporated into a benign vector for El Nido's elaborate communications network. The assassin had turned into a messenger boy. Any attempt to burn the vegetation is rapidly smothered by carbon dioxide, or more sophisticated fire retardants if a self-oxidizing fuel is employed. Once we even pumped in a few tons of nutrient laced with powerful radioisotopes, locked up in compounds chemically indistinguishable from their natural counterparts. We tracked the results with gamma-ray imaging. El Nido separated out the isotope-laden molecules, probably on the basis of their diffusion rates across organic membranes, sequestered and diluted them, and then pumped them right back out again. So, when I heard that a Peruvian-born biochemist named Guillermo Largo had departed from Bethesda, Maryland, with some highly classified genetic tools, the fruits of his own research, but very much the property of his employers, and vanished into El Nido, I thought, at last, an excuse for the big one. The company had been advocating thermonuclear rehabilitation of El Nido for almost a decade. The Security Council would have rubber-stamped it. The governments with nominal authority over the region would have been delighted. Hundreds of El Nido's inhabitants were suspected of violating U.S. law, and President Golino was aching for a chance to prove that she could play hardball south of the border, whatever language she spoke in the privacy of her own home. She could have gone on prime time afterward and told the nation that they should be proud of Operation Back to Nature, and that the 30,000 displaced farmers who'd taken refuge in El Nido from Colombia's undeclared civil war, and who had now been liberated forever from the oppression of Marxist terrorists and drug barons, would have saluted her courage and resolve. I never discovered why that wasn't to be. Technical problems in ensuring that no embarrassing side effects would show up downriver in the sacred Amazon itself, wiping out some telegenic endangered species before the end of the present administration. Concern that some Middle Eastern warlord might somehow construe the act as license to use his own feeble, long-hoarded fission weapons on a troublesome minority, destabilizing the region in an undesirable manner. Fear of Japanese trade sanctions now that the rapidly anti-nuclear eco-marketeers were back in power? I wasn't shown the verdicts of the geopolitical computer models. I simply received my orders, coded into the flicker of my local Kmart's fluorescent tubes, slipped in between the updates to the shelf price tags. Deciphered by an extra neural layer in my left retina, the words appeared blood red against the bland, cheery colors of the supermarket aisle. I was to enter El Nido and retrieve Guillermo Largo. alive. Dressed like a local real estate agent, right down to the gold plated bracelet phone and the worst of all possible $300 haircuts, I visited Largo's abandoned home in Bethesda, a northern suburb of Washington, just over the border into Maryland. The apartment was modern and spacious, neatly furnished but not opulent, about what any good marketing software might have tried to sell him, on the basis of salary less alimony. Largo had always been classified as brilliant but unsound, a potential security risk, but far too talented and productive to be wasted. He'd been under routine surveillance ever since the gloriously euphemistic Department of Energy had employed him, straight out of Harvard, back in 2005. Clearly, too routine by far. But then, I could understand how 30 years with an unblemished record must have given rise to a degree of complacency. Largo had never attempted to disguise his politics, apart from exercising the kind of discretion that was more a matter of etiquette than subterfuge. No Che Guevara t-shirts when visiting Los Alamos, but he'd never really acted on his beliefs either. A mural had been jet sprayed onto his living room wall in shades of near infrared, visible to most hip 14-year-old Washingtonians, if not to their parents. It was a copy of the infamous Li Hing-chung's A Tiling of the Plain with Heroes of the New World Order, a digital image that had spread across computer networks at the turn of the century. Early 90s political leaders, naked and interlocked, Escher meets the Kama Sutra, deposited steaming turds into each other's open and otherwise empty brain cases, an effect borrowed from the works of the German satirist George Grosz. And the Iraqi dictator was shown admiring his reflection in a hand mirror, the image an exact reproduction of a contemporary magazine cover, in which the mustache had been retouched to render it suitably Hitler-esque. The US president carried, horizontally but poised ready to be tilted, an egg timer full of the gaunt hostages whose release he'd delayed to clinch his predecessor's election victory. Everyone was shoehorned in somewhere, right down to the Australian Prime Minister, portrayed as a pubic louse, struggling, and failing, to fit its tiny jaws around the mighty presidential cock. I could imagine a few of the neo-McCarthyist troglodytes in the Senate going apoplectic if anything so tedious as an inquiry into Largo's defection ever took place. But what should we have done? Refused to hire him if he owned so much as a Guernica tea towel? Largo had blanked every computer in the apartment before leaving, including the entertainment system. But I already knew his taste in music, having listened to a few hours of audio surveillance samples full of bad Korean ska. No laudable revolutionary ethno-solidarity, no haunting Andean pipe music. A shame. I would have much preferred that. His bookshelves held several battered college-level biochemistry texts, presumably retained for sentimental purposes, and a few dozen musty literary classics and volumes of poetry in English, Spanish, and German. Hesse, Rilke, Vallejo, Conrad, Nietzsche. Nothing modern, and nothing printed after 2010. With a few words to the household manager, Largo had erased every digital work he'd ever owned, sweeping away the last quarter of a century of his personal archaeology. I flipped through the surviving books for what it was worth. There was a penciled-in correction to the structure of guanine in one of the texts, and a section had been underlined in Heart of Darkness. The narrator, Marlowe, was pondering the mysterious fact that the servants on the steamboat, members of a cannibal tribe, whose provisions of rotting hippo meat had been tossed overboard, hadn't yet rebelled and eaten him. After all, no fear can stand up to hunger, no patience can wear it out. Disgust simply does not exist where hunger is, And as to superstition, beliefs, and what you may call principles, they are less than chaff in a breeze. I couldn't argue with that, but I wondered why Largo had found the passage noteworthy. Perhaps it had struck a chord back in the days when he'd been trying to rationalize taking his first research grants from the Pentagon. The ink was faded, and the volume itself had been printed in 2003. I would rather have had copies of his diary entries for the fortnight leading up to his disappearance, but his household computers hadn't been systematically tapped for almost 20 years. I sat at the desk in his study and stared at the blank screen of his workstation. Largo had been born into a middle-class, nominally Catholic, very mildly leftist family in Lima in 1980. His father, a journalist with El Comercio, had died from a cerebral blood clot in 2029. His 78-year-old mother still worked as an attorney for an international mining company, going through the motions of habeas corpus for the families of disappeared radicals in her spare time, a hobby her employers tolerated for the sake of cheap PR brownie points in the shareholder democracies. Guillermo had one elder brother, a retired surgeon, and one younger sister, a primary school teacher, neither of them politically active. Most of his education had taken place in Switzerland and the States. After his PhD, he'd held a succession of research posts in government institutes, the biotechnology industry, and academia, all with more or less the same real sponsors. 55 now, thrice divorced, but still childless, he'd only ever returned to Lima for brief family visits. After 3 decades working on the military applications of molecular genetics, unwittingly at first, but not for long, what could have triggered his sudden defection to El Nido? If he'd managed the cynical doublethink of reconciling defense research and pious liberal sentiments for so long, he must have got it down to a fine art. His latest psychological profile suggested as much. Fierce pride in his scientific achievements balanced the self-loathing he felt when contemplating their ultimate purpose, with the conflict showing signs of decaying into comfortable indifference, a well-documented dynamic in the industry. And he seemed to have acknowledged, deep in his heart 30 years ago, that his principles were less than chaff in a breeze. Perhaps he'd decided, belatedly, that if he was going to be a whore, he might as well do it properly, and sell his skills to the highest bidder, even if that meant smuggling genetic weapons to a drugs cartel. I'd read his financial records, though. No tax fraud, no gambling debts, no evidence that he'd ever lived beyond his means. Betraying his employers, just as he'd betrayed his own youthful ideals to join them, might have seemed like an appropriately nihilistic gesture. But on a more pragmatic level, it was hard to imagine him finding the money, and the consequences, all that tempting. What could El Nido have offered him? A numbered satellite account, a new identity in Paraguay? All the squalid pleasures of life on the fringes of the third world plutocracy? He would have had everything to gain by living out his retirement in his adopted country, salving his conscience with one or two vitriolic essays on foreign policy in some unread left-wing netzine, and then finally convincing himself that any nation that granted him such unencumbered rights of free speech probably deserved everything he'd done to defend it. Exactly what he had done to defend it, though, what tools he'd perfected and stolen, I was not permitted to know. Oh, hey, thank you for tuning in, William Montenegro. As dusk fell, I locked the apartment and headed south down Wisconsin Avenue. Washington was coming alive, the streets already teeming with people looking for distraction from the heat. Nights in the cities were becoming hallucinatory. Teenagers sported bioluminescent symbionts, the veins in their temples, necks, and pumped up forearm muscles glowing electric blue, walking circulation diagrams who cultivated hypertension to improve the effect. Others used retinal symbionts to translate IR into visible light, their eyes flashing vampire red in the shadows. And others, less visibly, had a skull full of white knights. Stem cells in the bone marrow infected with Mother, an engineered retrovirus, gave rise to something halfway between an embryonic neuron and a white blood cell. White knights secreted the cytokines necessary to unlock the blood-brain barrier, and once through, cellular adhesion molecules guided them to their targets, where they could flood the site with a chosen neurotransmitter, or even form temporary quasi-synapses with genuine neurons. Users often had half a dozen or more subtypes in their bloodstream simultaneously, each one activated by a specific dietary additive. Some cheap, harmless, and perfectly legitimate chemical not naturally present in the body. By ingesting the right mixture of innocuous artificial colorings, flavors, and preservatives, they could modulate their neurochemistry in almost any fashion, until the white knights died, as they were programmed to do, and a new dose of Mother was required. Mother could be snorted or taken intravenously, but the most efficient way to use it was to puncture a bone and inject it straight into the marrow, an excruciating, messy, dangerous business, even if the virus itself was uncontaminated and authentic. The good stuff came from El Nido. The bad stuff came from basement labs in California and Texas, where gene hackers tried to force cell cultures infected with Mother to reproduce a virus expressly designed to resist their efforts, and churned out batches of mutant strains ideal for inducing leukemia, astrocytomas, Parkinson's disease, and assorted novel psychoses. Crossing the sweltering dark city, watching the heedlessly joyful crowds, I felt a penetrating, dreamlike clarity come over me. Part of me was numb, leaden, blank, but part of me was electrified, all-seeing. I seemed to be able to stare into the hidden landscapes of the people around me, to see deeper than the luminous rivers of blood, to pierce them with my vision right to the bone, right to the marrow. I drove to the edge of a park I had visited once before, and waited. I was already dressed for the part. Young people strode by, grinning, some glancing at the silver 2025 Ford Narcissus and whistling appreciatively. A teenaged boy danced on the grass, alone, tirelessly, blissed out on Coca-Cola and not even getting paid to fake it. Before too long, a girl approached the car, blue veins flashing on her bare arms. She leaned down to the window and looked in, inquiringly. "What you got?" She was 16 or 17, slender, dark-eyed, coffee-colored, with a faint Latino accent. She could have been my sister. "Southern Rainbow." All 12 major genotypes of Mother, straight from El Nido, cut with nothing but glucose. Southern Rainbow. And a little fast food could take you anywhere. The girl eyed me skeptically and stretched out her right hand, palm down. She wore a ring with a large multifaceted jewel, with a pit in the center. I took a sachet from the glove compartment, shook it, tore it open, and tipped a few specks of powder into the pit. Then I leaned over and moistened the sample with saliva, holding her cool fingers to steady her hand. 12 faces of the stone began to glow immediately, each one in a different color. The immunoelectric sensors in the pit, tiny capacitors coated with antibodies, were designed to recognize several sites on the protein codes of the different strains of Mother, particularly the ones the bootleggers had the most trouble getting right. With good enough technology, though, those proteins didn't have to bear the slightest relationship to the RNA inside. The girl seemed to be impressed. Her face lit up with anticipation. We negotiated a price. Too low by far. She should have been suspicious. I looked her in the eye before handing over the sachet. I said, "What do you need this shit for? The world is the world. You have to take it as it is. Accept it as it is. Savage and terrible. Be strong. Never lie to yourself. That's the only way to survive." She smirked at my apparent hypocrisy, but she was too pleased with her luck to turn nasty. I hear what you're saying. It's a bad planet out there. She forced the money into my hand, adding, with wide-eyed mock sincerity, "And this is the last time I do Mother, I promise." I gave her the lethal virus and watched her walk away across the grass and vanish into the shadows. The Colombian Air Force pilot who flew me down from Bogota didn't seem too thrilled to be risking his life for a DEA bureaucrat. It was 700 kilometers to the border, and 5 different guerrilla organizations held territory along the way. Not a lot of towns, but several hundred possible sites for rocket launchers. "My great grandfather," he said sourly, "died in fucking Korea fighting for General Douglas McFucking Arthur." I wasn't sure if that was meant to be a declaration of pride or an intimation of an outstanding debt. Both, probably. The helicopter was eerily silent, fitted out with phased sound absorbers, which looked like giant loudspeakers but swallowed most of the noise of the blades. The carbon fiber fuselage was coated with an expensive network of chameleon polymers, although it might have been just as effective to paint the whole thing sky blue. An endothermic chemical mixture accumulated waste heat from the motor, and then discharged it through a parabolic radiator as a tightly focused skywards burst every hour or so. The guerrillas had no access to satellite images and no radar they dared use. I decided that we had less chance of dying than the average Bogota commuter. Back in the capital, buses had been exploding without warning 2 or 3 times a week. Colombia was tearing itself apart. La Violencia of the 1950s all over again. Although all of the spectacular terrorist sabotage was being carried out by organized guerrilla groups, most of the deaths so far had been caused by factions within the 2 mainstream political parties, butchering each other's supporters, avenging a litany of past atrocities which stretched back for generations. The group who'd actually started the current wave of bloodshed had negligible support. Ejército de Simón Bolívar were lunatic right-wing extremists who wanted to reunite with Panama, Venezuela, and Ecuador after 2 centuries of separation, and drag in Peru and Bolivia to realize Bolivar's dream of Gran Colombia. By assassinating President Marin, though, they triggered a cascade of events that had nothing to do with their ludicrous cause. Strikes and protests, street battles, curfews, martial law, the repatriation of foreign capital by nervous investors, followed by hyperinflation and the collapse of the local financial system. Then a spiral of opportunistic violence. Everyone, from the paramilitary death squads to the Maoist splinter groups, seemed to believe that their hour had finally come. I hadn't seen so much as a bullet fired, but from the moment I'd entered the country, there'd been acid churning in my guts, and a heady, ceaseless adrenaline rush coursing through my veins. I felt wired, feverish, alive. Hypersensitive as a pregnant woman, I could smell blood everywhere. When the hidden struggle for power which rules all human affairs finally breaks through to the surface, finally ruptures the skin, it's like witnessing some giant primordial creature rise up out of the ocean. Mesmerizing and appalling, nauseating and exhilarating. Coming face to face with the truth is always exhilarating. From the air, there was no obvious sign that we'd arrived. For the last 200 kilometers, we'd been passing over rainforest. Cleared in patches for plantations and mines, ranches and timber mills, shot through with rivers like metallic threads, but most of it resembling nothing so much as an endless expanse of broccoli. El Nido permitted natural vegetation to flourish all around it. and then imitated it, which made sampling at the edges an inefficient way to gather the true genetic stock for analysis. Deep penetration was difficult, though, so even Whoops. Deep penetration was difficult, though, even with the purpose-built robots, dozens of which had been lost, so edge samples had to suffice, at least until a few more members of Congress could be photographed committing statutory rape and persuaded to vote for better funding. Most of the engineered plant tissues self-destructed in the absence of regular chemical and viral messages drifting out from the core, reassuring them that they were still in situ. So, the main DEA research facility was on the outskirts of El Nido itself, a collection of pressurized buildings and experimental plots in a clearing blasted out of the jungle on the Colombian side of the border. The electrified fences weren't topped with razor wire, they turned 90 degrees into an electrified roof, completing a chain link cage. The heliport was in the center of the compound, where a cage within the cage could, temporarily, open itself to the sky. Madeline Smith, the research director, showed me around. In the open, we both wore hermetic biohazard suits, although if the modifications I'd received in Washington were working as promised, mine was redundant. Blech. El Nido's short-lived defense viruses occasionally percolated out this far. They were never fatal, but they could be severely disabling to anyone who hadn't been inoculated. The forest's designers had walked a fine line between biological self-defense and unambiguously military applications. Guerrillas had always hidden in the engineered jungle and raised funds by collaborating in the export of mother, but El Nido's technology had never been explicitly directed towards the creation of lethal pathogens. So far. Here we're raising seedlings of what we hope will be a stable El Nido phenotype, something we call Beta 17. They were remarkable bushes, with deep green foliage and dark red berries. Smith pointed to an array of camera-like instruments beside them. Real-time infrared microspectroscopy. It can resolve a medium-sized RNA transcript if there's a sharp surge in production in a sufficient number of cells simultaneously. We match up the data from these with our gas chromatography records, which show the range of molecules drifting out from the core. If we can catch these plants in the act of sensing a cue from El Nido, and if their response involves switching on a gene and synthesizing a protein, we may be able to elucidate the mechanism and eventually short-circuit it. You can't just sequence all the DNA and work it out from the first principles? I was meant to be passing as a newly appointed administrator, dropping in at short notice to check for gold-plated paper clips, but it was hard to decide exactly how naive to sound. Smith smiled politely. El Nido DNA is guarded by enzymes which tear it apart at the slightest hint of cellular disruption. Right now, we'd have about as much chance of sequencing it as I'd have of reading your mind by autopsy. And we still don't know how those enzymes work. We have a lot of catching up to do. When the drug cartels started investing in biotechnology 40 years ago, copy protection was their first priority. And they lured the best people away from legitimate labs around the world. Not just by paying more, but by offering more creative freedom and more challenging goals. El Nido probably contains as many patentable inventions as the entire agrotechnology industry produced in the same period, and all of them are a lot more exciting. Was that what had brought Largo here? More challenging goals? But El Nido was complete. The challenge was over. Any further work was mere refinement. And at 55, surely he knew that his most creative years were long gone. I said, I imagine the cartels got more than they bargained for. The technology transformed their business beyond recognition. All the old addictive substances became too easy to synthesize biologically, too cheap, too pure, and too readily available to be profitable. And addiction itself became bad business. The only thing that really sells now is novelty. Smith motioned with bulky arms toward the towering forest outside the cage. Turning to face turning to face southeast, although it looked all the same. El Nido was more than they bargained for. All they really wanted was coca plants that did better at lower altitudes, and some gene-tailored vegetation to make it easier to camouflage their labs and plantations. They ended up with a small de facto nation full of gene hackers, anarchists, and refugees. The cartels are only in control of certain regions. Half the original geneticists have split off and founded their own little jungle utopias. There are at least a dozen people who know how to program the plants, how to switch on new patterns of gene expression, how to tap into the communications networks, and with that, you can stake out your own territory. Like having some secret shamanistic power to command the spirits of the forest? Exactly, except for the fact that it actually works. I laughed. Do you know what cheers me up the most? Whatever else happens, the real Amazon, the real jungle, will swallow them all in the end. It's lasted, what, 2 million years? Their own little utopias. In 50 years' time, or 100, it'll be as if El Nido had never existed. Less than chaff in the breeze. Smith didn't reply. In the silence, I could hear the monotonous click of beetles from all directions. Bogota, high on a plateau, had been almost chilly. Here it was as sweltering as Washington itself. I glanced at Smith. She said, "You're right, of course," but she didn't sound convinced at all. In the morning, over breakfast, I reassured Smith that I'd found everything to be in order. She smiled warily. I think she suspected that I wasn't what I claimed to be, but that didn't really matter. I'd listened carefully to the gossip of the scientists, technicians, and soldiers. The name Guillermo Largo hadn't been mentioned once. If they didn't even know about Largo, they could hardly have guessed my real purpose. It was just after 9 when I departed. On the ground, sheets of light, delicate as auroral displays, sliced through the trees around the compound. When we emerged above the canopy, it was like stepping from a mist-shrouded dawn into the brilliance of noon. The pilot, begrudgingly, took a detour over the center of El Nido. "We're in Peruvian airspace now," he boasted. "You want to spark a diplomatic incident?" He seemed to find the possibility attractive. "No, but fly lower." "There's nothing to see. You can't even see the river." "Lower." The broccoli grew large. Bleh. The broccoli grew larger, then suddenly snapped into focus. All that undifferentiated green turned into individual branches, solid and specific. It was curiously shocking, like looking at some dull familiar object through a microscope and seeing its strange particularity revealed. I reached over and broke the pilot's neck. He hissed through his teeth, surprised. A shudder passed through me, a mixture of fear and a twinge of remorse. The autopilot kicked in and kept us hovering. It took me 2 minutes to unstrap the man's body, drag him into the cargo hold, and take his